live in Texas and decided to go to Colorado with my then fiancé and his sister to visit his mother for a week. We opted to travel after work at about 6:30 and go through New Mexico while traveling at night to maximize our time. I decided to drive first because I enjoy driving at night, and I had time for a quick nap before we took off while my ex finished packing. So we loaded into the car and took off at around midnight. We were pretty far into our trip, and I was the only one awake. I had stopped to fill up the gas tank and get a Coke before the craziest part of the driving started. We were supposed to have switched seats at this time, but my ex and his sister were both still snoring, and I figured I could keep going. I drove into the New Mexican darkness for a few hours until I entered a town called Oscuro, which, by the way, is Spanish for dark. It was about 2:30 a.m. at this point, and as I was driving, I noticed a dead tree off the highway a few miles ahead. I made a joke about how dark Oscuro was to myself as I drove close to the tree. It was at this point I saw what looked like a woman's body in a tan slip dress hanging from it. I obviously freaked out but swore to myself I was just tired and hallucinating. But the entire time, I could see the body just hanging. Finally, as I was getting super close, I saw the arm of the woman outstretched and pointing at the road. I drove past the tree so quickly and refused to turn my head to see, but I looked in the rearview mirror, and her body had shifted to still be facing the car, and her arm was still pointing towards the road. I was rattled and drove away as fast as I could until I couldn't see her anymore, and stopped at the next gas station to calm myself down, and finally to switch drivers. I was so scared that when I woke up my ex, he asked me why I was so pale, as I'm a fairly tan Hispanic person. We went into the gas station, used the restroom, and filled up again. My ex ended up saying he wasn't feeling well, and I offered to drive again, even though I was still very uncomfortable with the idea. His sister refused to wake up when we nudged her, so I was out of luck. The last weird thing that happened that night was while everyone was still sleeping at exactly 3:03 a.m. For 3 minutes in New Mexico, the road got covered in a fog that was so thick I couldn't see 3 feet in front of me. I was way too spooked not to wake up my passengers this time, but they ended up seeing it as well and were very confused by how, in the desert during a reasonably warm night, there's fog so thick you can't see a body of water nearby for 3 minutes, and it just completely vanished after that. Anyway, I got us to my ex's mom's house and refused to drive the way back. But once again, I was forced to once the week was up, and this time, while passing the same tree, there was nothing there. I have no idea how to explain it, and I wouldn't call myself a skeptic, but I also have never seen anything like this before. If anyone has any ideas on what I saw or what she may have been, I would love to hear your take on it. I think there is something paranormal in my apartment. I moved in on October 31st, 2018, without the knowledge that a previous tenant had died in the apartment. I'm a paramedic, so I can deal with death a little differently than others. So when I found out from my downstairs neighbor Gina, it didn't bother me. According to my neighbor, the tenant Katie was a younger female in her early 30s who had reluctantly given birth to her first child. Gina said Katie was a nice woman but had a history of drug abuse and had an abusive boyfriend who was also a drug dealer. Shortly after Katie gave birth to her child, she was found dead in the apartment from a heroin overdose while holding the baby. I did not ask specific details of where she was found because I didn't want to know. I work night shifts, so I am usually sleeping during the day, unless it's my days off when I try to turn myself around and be a normal human being to interact with the world. For the past month and a half, I've been waking up between 3 o'clock and 3:30, and I can't explain why. Sometimes I will have to use the bathroom, and other times I just wake up and am unable to go back to sleep. About a week ago, something eerie happened. I was asleep in my bed with my dog and cat when I woke up to what sounded like a woman screaming bloody murder in my ear. It didn't jolt me awake or startle me. I was more confused than anything. Afterward, I was unable to fall back asleep and just stayed awake until the afternoon because I had to work that night. When I looked at the time, I noticed it was 3:13 a.m. After work, at around 8 a.m., I laid down and had trouble sleeping because my downstairs neighbor Gina and her husband Robert were pulling up carpet and pounding on the walls with what I can only assume was a hammer for 6 hours. When I woke up at 2 p.m., they were still at it. I attempted to go to sleep around 10 p.m. that night, but probably fell asleep at midnight. I woke up at 3:12 a.m., annoyed at not being able to fall back asleep, but something was off this night. I sleep with my door cracked open so that the cat can come and go as it pleases, and I've never had an issue with it until this day. I felt as if someone was watching me in the hallway. I then rolled over and scrolled through Facebook for about an hour and a half and decided to go run a bath. I got out of the bath at 5 a.m. and walked into my bedroom when I heard a sound at the front of the apartment. I can't really describe this sound, but if anything, it sounded like a thud. I walked out of my room and into the front of the apartment and saw that the light cover to my kitchen light was hanging. I thought it was odd, but really didn't pay attention to it and put it back. I took my mom to breakfast that morning and decided to tell her what I had experienced. She knows about Katie's passing in the apartment, and she has also experienced paranormal activity personally. My mom kind of shrugged it off and said, "I have difficulty sleeping due to working nights, and a light cover falling isn't a big deal." Respectfully, I agreed, and after breakfast, we went to the grocery store. I returned back to my apartment, and my brother came over to help bring up all the groceries because I live on the second floor, and no one likes doing multiple trips to get groceries out of the car. While I was finishing, my mom called me and asked where I was. When I told her I was still at my apartment, she asked if I was messing with her. Confused, I said no and asked why. At that point, my mom told me to hurry up and get to her apartment. When I arrived, my mom was in her bedroom, looking visibly nervous. She was supposed to have come and inspected her sprinkler that day in her apartment, so she had her bedroom door shut. She said that while she was laying in bed, someone knocked hard on her door 3 times, causing the entire door to shake. After opening the door, she noticed no one was there. She said that she checked the entire apartment and no one was in it, and that the front door was still locked. Trying to recreate the sound and shaking of the door, the only possible way was if someone knocked directly on her bedroom door with force. After leaving my mom's apartment, I went back to mine, and once I met the front door, I had an uneasy feeling. I can't explain why, but as soon as I got up to the door, it just felt like a negative energy. I went in, greeted my animals, and decided I was going to take a nap due to barely getting any sleep the night before. I went into my bedroom, which is in the very back of the apartment, and went to lay down. My dog followed suit and jumped on the bed and came to her spot. She sleeps in the same spot every time we go to bed, which is at the top of the bed, right next to me. I noticed when she jumped on the bed, she was slow to get to her spot. When she did, she immediately looked up at the ceiling above my head, prompting me to look and see if there was a bug. There was nothing. My dog proceeded to look at the ceiling and look away for short periods of time, approximately 20 minutes before she refused to sleep in her spot and went to the end of the bed to lay down, still looking at the ceiling. I was unnerved but somehow managed to fall asleep. When I woke up about an hour later, I was drenched in sweat, like you would be when breaking a fever. I kept my apartment at 68 degrees Fahrenheit during the summer. I have a fan on me, and I sleep in light clothes. I usually get cold and did not wake up hot, so I thought this was odd. Later that night, I had a friend over, and we were sitting on the couch watching movies. Let me explain the layout of the living room. When you walk through the front door, you're immediately met by a wall. If you look to the right, there is a closet, and if you look to the left, the living room is right there. I have a sliding glass back door that leads to the balcony with blinds, like almost every apartment complex has. I have a large sectional couch, and the only way for it to fit is to block the back door. At around 2:30 a.m., while watching a horror movie, we heard 2 knocks directly behind our heads on the back door. We both looked at each other, and I said, "There's no way that a person could be on my balcony." I opened the blinds within probably 15 seconds and looked out. Obviously, no one was there. At this point, I'm getting creeped out. He ended up staying until sunrise at 6:30 a.m. and then left. I didn't plan on going to sleep until it was daylight. During these days, I had trouble sleeping because all I could think about is what kind of spirit is in my home or if it's something worse. I used a Ouija board when I was 14, so I have my own experience from that, and it's not something I want to relive. One of my co-workers is very spiritual and cleanses her house weekly because she buys a lot of antique furniture. So she was the first person I contacted. She told me I needed to go get white sage, and that she would send me cleansing prayers, but that I needed to do it soon. Unfortunately, I worked all weekend, and this was Friday, so I could not go to do it immediately. So I stayed at my parents' house until I could. After work, I went to my apartment and was met with the negative energy again once I reached the door. I had to get my cat and dog because I wasn't leaving them in there alone. It might be silly, but I didn't want to go in there, and I'm not going to leave them there. The next day, I needed to go back and gather some clothes and sleepwear, so I convinced my brother and his girlfriend to go with me. My brother is skeptical about paranormal things, but his girlfriend, like I am, is a believer. They take it seriously to not provoke or enrage the spirit, so I had chosen to ignore it. Unfortunately, my brother did not get this memo, and as we were walking up to the door, he said, "Maybe I'll believe it if it moves the blind or something." I told him not to taunt it, but he didn't listen. I grabbed what I needed and headed back down to the car. When I got to the driver's side door, something was telling me to look up at the balcony, and when I did, the blinds were moving back and forth. I looked over at my brother and his girlfriend and said, "Do you believe me now?" And the look on their faces confirmed that they saw the exact thing I did. I'm gonna smudge the apartment, but I'm curious if anyone knows what type of spirit I might be dealing with. I haven't been hurt by anything, and everything that has happened to me has been subtle and not alarming. I'm moving out next month. I wasn't renewing my lease to begin with, so this has nothing to do with not staying there anymore. This all started happening mostly after Gina and Robert were remodeling their apartment. They recently got back from a trip, and anyway, they saw me outside and said they would speak to me since they got a home a few weeks ago, and they don't talk to me. Interactions have been strange since then. Gina is avid for being outside watering her garden, but I've noticed her garden is dying, and I don't see her outside anymore. Robert's vehicle hasn't moved from its parking spot since they got back, and he usually leaves every day. Could there be something sinister going on here? My brother used to work the graveyard shift at a grocery store. Usually there were 3 employees during the shift. Everyone started at 9:30 p.m., except for my brother. He started at 3 a.m. I remember him telling me creepy stories that would happen there. One time, a guy got robbed while walking to the store entrance from the parking lot. Another time, someone was throwing out trash and saw a homeless guy sleeping by it. One time, my brother was on break, sitting in his car, and saw a guy looking in cars. There are just so many stories he shared with me. The most scary for him is the one he experienced 2 years ago, before he resigned as he got another better-paying job. He had just parked his car, and as usual, he always looked around before getting down. He didn't see anyone and decided to get down. He started walking up to the store when he heard footsteps behind him. He looked and saw a guy wearing all black. The guy had an oversized jacket and a hoodie on. My brother was walking at a normal pace, and this guy was speed walking. My brother starts walking faster and puts his hand into his pocket where he has a box cutter utility knife. As he is approaching the entrance, he prays to God that someone opens the door fast, as sometimes he'd have to wait about 10 minutes before the other employees would open it. They were jerks anyway. As he turned the corner, he sees another employee smoking a cigarette in front of the store. When the creep turns the corner and sees the other guy, he immediately turns around and walks back to where he came from. The other employee asked my brother if he was following him. My brother replied in the affirmative, and that if it wasn't for him being outside, he would have had to fight the guy. My brother was the most respectful and hard worker I know, but he always tells me that he was not going to go out without a fight. I would always worry for him because of all the stories he told me. A lot of people would even quit because they didn't want to be a victim of those guys. Some refuse to take out the trash alone. I feel like my brother got lucky that night. Even he feels that way. He said in all the 10 years he worked there, he never saw an employee outside. He would always have to wait a couple of minutes, knocking on the glass, calling the store for someone to open the door, and sometimes he'd even see an employee standing a few feet from him stocking the shelves, and they would just ignore him. For all you graveyard workers, be aware of your surroundings. I work night shift in a hospital as a caregiver. Part of my job entails watching over disoriented and confused patients, and ones that are approaching death. I am working in the medical ward, so we have a lot of elderly patients with dementia and/or Alzheimer's. A few nights ago, we admitted a very tiny old lady of 91 with pneumonia. She is completely blind, but totally mobile, and her mind is still crystal clear. She used to be an English teacher, and her whole personality and the way she speaks, as well as her vocabulary and pronunciation, attest to that. A very stubborn, independent, and strong-willed lady. I was assigned to take care of her for the night, as she was not familiar with the layout of the room and would walk into things trying to find the bathroom and possibly injure herself. It went well for the first few hours. We chatted about stuff until about 11 o'clock, when I said she must try to get some sleep. I'm sitting right by her side and she can just say if she needs anything. She agrees, turns over, and makes herself comfortable. After a while she's fiddling with the blankets and being restless, I lean over to her to switch on the dim bedside light to see how I can help her. When she says to me, "Oh, you have the most beautiful blue eyes." While I'm trying to figure out how this blind lady knows I have blue eyes and how to respond, she continues, "And while you're up, please get an extra blanket for the little boy that's sitting on my bed. His skin is cold as ice." As if there's nothing weird about it, I immediately got a cold shiver down my back, and the hair on the back of my neck stood up. As if that wasn't enough, the call bell and the bathroom in the room started ringing without anyone being there. I switched the bell off and told her that I would be back now with a blanket, and went to ask a colleague to relieve me and take a blanket in. Everything I'm sure can be rationally explained away, but as I'm fascinated by the paranormal, I found this experience chilling and wanted to share it. Lots of weird stuff happens at the hospital, especially at night, and it's easy to get creeped out when alone in the dark with the dying or disoriented patient. I worked permanent night shifts in a large care home for 2.5 years. It was a really old house that had been converted and had bits added onto it. Often, it sometimes buzzed in the night, and would wake up at least one other person who would usually want to go to the toilet, get a drink, or think it was time to wake up. Our duties involved helping people to bed, and then some nights, cleaning and doing laundry. We stayed as quiet as we could to avoid waking anyone. Every now and then, we would have several people buzz within 2 minutes of each other, asking us to tell the children to stop running around and playing outside, and wondering why they were up so late and where their parents were. This only happened on one side of the building. Several other staff members believed it to be haunted as well. When I was a child, I lived in the Mojave Desert, which is ground zero for a lot of paranormal events, notably Roswell, Area 51, and also just tons of abandoned towns, which makes it all that much creepier. I was living relatively close to Edwards Air Force Base, which was pretty much Area 51 before we knew Area 51 existed. Anyway, in my childhood home, there was never any yelling or fighting. My parents were married and still are, and I was not abused in any way. Initially, I thought what had happened was a result of my parents hitting me for some reason, but I didn't see their faces because they did not have any. In this instance, I remember that night so vividly. I didn't know about shadow people until I was around 15 or 16. Even then, I didn't connect that I had experienced them. I recently clicked a few months ago when I had thought back to the experience. So, this one night, I was getting ready for bed, and I was in the bath. I was playing around with the bubbles in the bath, putting it on my head to make a hat. I'm pretty sure I washed it off my head because I doubt I would go to bed with bubbles on my head. I've gone to sleep but awoke feeling a presence. Like I said before, I thought it was my parents, but these beings had no faces and were just shadows. I had a nightlight so I could tell that there was something there. I saw 3 or more of these shadow people moving around the front of my room and talking to each other about me. I don't know what exactly they were saying, but I knew they were speaking because they kept pointing at me and huddled up together, as if saying, "Okay, what's the plan, y'all?" I wasn't afraid of them until shortly after. Now, after looking at them for a hot second, one of them shoots over and puts me in a chokehold while pushing me onto the pillow. I couldn't breathe and was squirming around trying to free myself. While this was going on, I see what you would see if you looked through a kaleidoscope, except instead of looking through it, it's like I fell into it. It reminded me of when you play PS2 and the camera would fall into that abyss of fog when it booted. I thought to myself, that's the last time I put soap on my head. I've never been abused, but I imagined that that is what it felt like. I fell into a deep sleep. The morning after, I went up to my mom to tell her about it. At this point, my only experience with anything even slightly paranormal was at the movie Monsters, Inc., so I did not have the vocabulary to say what those beings were. My parents were super conservative and Christian, so they didn't let us find out about all that stuff. The conversation went like this. "Mom, I saw Scully last night, and he hurt me." Scully's a nice monster. He wasn't nice to me. Hella spooky, right? After that, I didn't sleep for 3 days straight and had several panic attacks. My mom kept giving me Benadryl to make me go to sleep, but that just made me hallucinate and made me become more afraid to go to sleep. I straight up saw bugs crawling out of the walls. Thanks, Mom. I was convinced that if I went to sleep, I would be attacked again, and this time I would perish. Eventually, I did fall asleep, and fortunately, nothing has happened to me since then. I work in maintenance in a hospital, but this story comes from out of work hours. Back in November, my grandfather passed away. He had been living in a care home for several years now, and as we were from a smaller city, his main care aide was actually an ex's mother who I'm still close to. Nearing his final days, she texted me that things weren't looking good and to get my mom, who works out of town, and myself to see him ASAP. The next 2 nights were exhausting. Her and I barely left his bedside. We were wetting his lips, rubbing his head, and singing Charlie Pride songs and telling him stories from my childhood and from my mom's. At one point, "Is Anybody Going to San Antonio" comes on the CD player, and Mom tears up talking about how this song reminds her of her father the most. He wasn't really coherent besides a glimmering moment on the first day we got there, and by the final day, we were sitting, watching the breaths turn to choke breaths as the hours got nearer. My ex's mom was contacted and came in on her day off to sit with us for that final hour. My mom had her father's head in her lap, and we still had Charlie Pride on the radio. She was whispering in his ear to stop being stubborn, and that she could take care of her brothers, and that she had me to take care of her. The gaps got longer and longer in his breaths. All of a sudden, his breathing stops, and in that moment, so did the CD player. It hadn't skipped once the whole weekend. My mom figured Irene had turned it off, starting to sob, assuming it was to signify he was officially gone. I sat and looked at Irene like, did that just happen? And after a good 20 seconds, out of nowhere, he took a shuddering breath, and the CD scrambled forward, and the song just before, "Is Anybody Going to San Antonio?" Not sure if that's the name of the song, but it was about not wanting to miss someone, started playing. And then he was gone by the end of San Antonio, the song that Mom remembered him most by. Irene mentioned odd things happen more often than not as a person finally passes. This story took place in Germany around the year 1997. Back then, my dad and mom were both in their 20s. They were already dating for a while when this story took place. On that evening, my mom, my dad, and my dad's father, so my grandfather, as well as my dad's brother, my uncle, had just watched the new movie Titanic and were heading home at around midnight on an empty country road. All 4 of them were chatting about the movie, and discussing their favorite part when my father saw something next to the road. It was already pitch black outside, and there were no streetlights, so he wasn't sure what he saw or if he even saw anything at all. He told my grandpa to turn the car around because he saw something in the ditch next to the road. Because the road was empty, my grandfather turned the car around and headed back to the spot my dad thought he saw something. My dad really did see something. There was a car crashed against a tree in the ditch by the side of the road. What my father had seen were the weak glow of the car's back lights. All of them jumped out and ran over to the car. Inside, they saw someone at the steering wheel, slumped over. Before they did anything else, my dad pulled over to my grandpa and told them to get back in the car and drive to the closest town, which was about 10 minutes away. Because at the time, none of them had a phone with them, my grandpa did so and drove away. So my dad, mom, and uncle went closer to the car and started examining to see if the person behind the steering wheel was still breathing. This person was a 30-year-old male. My uncle was 17 and was just doing his driver's license, so he had just done the first aid course. He checked for a pulse straight away, and there was nothing. The steering wheel had jabbed and crushed the man's ribcage, so he was stuck in the car. There was no way to get him out. After my uncle informed my parents that the man was deceased, they went to the side door and looked to see if there was any information about who the man was. The thing that stuck out the most in the car was the creepy things. The radio was still on, and a quiet tune was still humming. The song was "The Long and Winding Road," written by the Beatles. Up to this day, my mom can't listen to this song without thinking of that night. There was also a bag of bread in the car, which was now scattered around the front part of the car. On the man's lap was a milk carton busted open. The milk was still leaking onto his pants and car seat. My mom, dad, and uncle soon realized there was nothing more they could do. The man was already dead, and my grandpa was already getting help. So they sat there in the middle of the pitch-black night on the cold grass next to the car with the car radio still on. My parents said that the creepy thing was seeing how fast someone's life is ripped out. One minute the man is in his car drinking milk, listening to music, and eating bread. The next, his chest is being crushed by his steering wheel, and he perishes. Please don't take your life for granted, and make sure the people you love know that you love them. Who knows? That could be the last time you ever see them. Hey there. Hope you enjoyed these stories. If you can, please like and subscribe. I would appreciate it. See you next time.